Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, this is our special Today we have one of our special. Today we have one of our special members-only episodes where we take a look at kind of one of the deeper issues. We're often going to be inspired by one particular piece of media or another, but in these monthly episodes, we're trying to look at like some of the deeper questions that come up again and again and again, even though they might be inspired by one particular thing to start off with. This week, as we're getting ready to record this, we're only a couple of days away until the new season, season 2 of Andor, Star Wars Andor, comes out. We're doing a lot of coverage of that over on Star Wars Generations podcast. But one of the major questions that's being explored in Andor that I think is very relevant to a lot of the stories that we read, a lot of stories that we watch and enjoy and things like that, and somewhat relevant to many of us in the world today, is what are the responsibilities of being a civilian in a world with fascism, in a world with authoritarianism, in a world with governments that aren't necessarily representing what we might want them to do and, might be doing terrible things? And where's the lines of survival versus complicity versus, need to resist versus need to not put yourself at risk and protect your family versus protecting your community and all those kind of things. Andor obviously deals with these in a lot of ways. The book that I recently read, Sunrise on the Reaping, the new Hunger Games book, we did a full episode of that with Danielle, but that book touched on this issue quite a lot. And so we thought it would be a good time to kind of jump right into it. Enrique, you were the one who suggested this episode, so let me kind of just start with you. Where were you kind of coming from when you thought about wanting to dive into these questions?
Yes, hello, Matthew. Hello, listeners. As you said, I have been rewatching Andor, again,
Right.
for the who knows how many time, in preparation for the new season. And it really struck me how there are characters in the show, just like complete nothing side characters, who nonetheless like have these stories of how they fit in that I was like very fascinated by on this rewatch. And this was mostly inspired or originally inspired by Chief Hine, who, again, I say that name. It's like, who is that? He is the supervisor of Inspector Cyril Karn, who is kind of the antagonist pursuing Andor. He's like a security officer for Preox Morlana, I believe is what it's called. And he's basically a cop, right? He's like a cop for this corporation, a security officer, but they carry weapons. They have blasters, and they are, adjacent to the Empire,
Right.
because they are subservient to the Empire. I guess not technically Imperial officers. And then we see the complications that arise after the incident on Ferrix when the Empire comes in and takes over. And what really fascinated me was that Chief Hine gives this speech to Cyril when Cyril Karn like tries to pursue this investigation of these murders that Andor has committed, and basically says like, nah, leave it alone. I was like, that's fascinating. So I just like had to bring that in to this discussion.
No, I think it's a great starting place because I think there are characters in these stories who it's very easy to say, oh, that's what we should be doing. The people who are rebelling all the time. But the reality is, and I think this is part of what I love about Andor so much, is that even when we're fighting against the classic example of the evil empire, there are still questions that come up about what is your complicity and what is the level to which, individual survival, your survival of your family, to what extent are you reaffirming the power of those things? Because, and this is a theme that is very strong in that new Hunger Games book, but it's something any person who's taken Poli-Sci 101 can tell you. At the end of the day, almost every government derives its power, no matter how fascistic and totalitarian and authoritarian it might be, or any kind of authoritarian, from the consent of the people. And the consent of the people might be not true consent because it's consent under threat of death. But there is still, that those governments fall when the people stop consenting, when they stop complying, when they say, I am willing to risk death in order to not have this government happen. And I say that as though that's a very easy thing to do. Of course, the whole point is that governments are very good at making it seem like, no, that's a terrible idea and you shouldn't do that. And you'll be alone when you do that, so your death won't actually lead to anything. But, I remember reading something when I was in high school that talked about this. And it wasn't Thoreau, but it was someone of that kind of time talking about why they didn't pay taxes. And part of it was that they were talking about because, if they, I think this was the time of the Spanish American War, I'm not sure, but it was a time when like America was doing something with its military that people didn't really like. Of course, we can't relate to that at all today. But and the person was like, look, by paying taxes, I am giving my complicity to the actions of this government. And the person wound up going to jail. And they were willing to do that for their principles because they didn't want to comply and be part of that government. There's a part of me that like thinks that's an ideal thing to do, but I also recognize that if enough people don't do it, you're just going to go to jail, and then you get the question of, and so my point being, like, I don't want to approach this question from the perspective of it's always better to not be complicit. That I think all of us are in some ways complicit in terrible systems in one way or another. Really what I think Andor does a great job of exploring, and some other things do a great job of exploring, is what are all the different levels in which people, because you've got Cyril participating in the system, you've got that guy who's his supervisor maybe participating, he's a little more trying to keep his head down. You've got other people who are maybe like, they're willing to secretly deal with Lucian, but it's not until this rebellion starts on their home planet that they're willing to stand up and take a higher stand. And I just think it's a really interesting question for us to explore of to what extent, can we heroize and lionize people who are standing against and are not complying? And to what extent can we or should we sit in judgment? I mean, I don't think ever sitting in judgment of others is actually very useful, but like, how can we view those people? Like, is there a point of which of saying like, no, that people are complying too much and we wish they weren't complying so much, or they're under threat, we can understand it, or how does any of that work?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I love this character of Hein, is because he isn't just complicit. He is like full on collaboration, right? Being
Right.
a security officer for an empire adjacent corporation
Right.
is, I mean, he's a cop.
Mm-hmm.
And that's complicit, that is collaboration. And yet, I mean, I would argue that he is resisting the empire in his own capacity in a way,
Mm-hmm.
in that speech he gives, because basically what he's telling Karn is, don't do this, don't draw the attention of the empire in the form of the ISB,
Right.
because they are in the process of just imperializing everything, taking over like private corporations and making them subsidies of the state. And he's shown to be correct, right? Karn goes off on his adventure, gets a couple more guys killed, and blows stuff up in Ferrix, and then Chief Inspector or Inspector Blevins from the ISB comes in and says, "Yo, we're taking over now. Thanks."
Right.
Like, this is all the excuse I needed.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting thing because as opposed to Cyril, I think that guy, he's a collaborator, but it really seems like he's doing it for a paycheck. He's doing it to get by in this hard world, which I think he's still participating in the empire in a horrible way, and I think that's still something we can look back and see as deeply problematic. But that's very different than someone like Cyril, who clearly believes in this. Like, he genuinely thinks he is doing good. He is making things better. And part of what I love about Andor so much, and we won't just be talking about that as an example, but it starts us off as, like, if you take away the context, what Cyril knows is that two people who were kind of under his protection of his agency were murdered.
Yeah.
And he wants to investigate it. Like, that's, I mean,
his character sucks,
context,
right? Like, the whole show is like, this guy sucks.
Right.
And yet they draw our sympathies with all of his like breakfast scenes with his mother.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, I know that feeling. where he
Yep.
just like sucks down his cereal and milk. And then yeah, he's investigating murder. He's like, we need to bring someone to justice for murder.
Right.
And if you just phrase it like that, it's like, oh yeah, I agree with that. And
What
yet here we are.
And I think part of what is so important about his character, and I think we see characters like this in a lot of other shows, is the person who's seeking order. Um, this is kind of outside the superhero genre, but it's a genre that I'm sure we have a lot of overlap with, and that I certainly love. He makes me think of Javert from Les Miserables, which some people might know the book. If you're a very brave reader, I tried to get through it. I couldn't do it, but I know the musical inside and out, and I think many people just at least know the ideas of it. You know, Javert is an investigator. He's a police investigator in a very corrupt, broken part of France, of French history, when people are rebelling against the government. But for him, he needs things to, he needs things to be ordered and settled. And his famous song is about the stars and how the stars have paths and they're not chaotic, and that everything should be rigid and simple. And one of the stories you get so often in things like this is because that's the thing, is authoritarianism isn't like that. It's by the whim of the people running it. It's not with due process or anything like that. And a character like that always has that moment of how long have I been justifying this thing that actually cannot be justified? And here I'm thinking of like the cop from V for Vendetta, who winds up kind of being on V's side by the end. Javert is one, but like there's a lot of others who, like, we see, as an anti-hero, but who, an antagonist, but eventually become an anti-hero because they realize they can't stick with the system anymore. And I don't really know if I want that from Cyril, but I think one of the things I'm most curious about is to see what direction they're going to go with him.
Yeah, I definitely recall watching Andor for the first time as the series reached kind of the midpoint. I definitely had a time when I thought, I wonder if Cyril Karn and Andor will end up on the same side.
Right.
Do you recall that feeling
I
of
do.
like
I do.
uncertainty?
And I think I definitely would not have wanted it in season one. It would have felt a little too easy. And I feel like this goes to a larger issue, and you and I did a whole episode on this. But part of why I want there to be relatable villains is I think a relatable villain challenges us. No one in their right mind is ever going to look at Emperor Palpatine and think, gosh, if I'm not careful, I could wind up like that person. But I could look at Anakin, and remember myself at age 20 and think, yeah, when I, got my heart broken, I was a freaking idiot about it. And I could see that I acted terribly to people and stuff like that. And gosh, I'm glad I didn't have ability to do anything worse. And I think that's like, good villains should challenge us. And so there's a part of me that doesn't want him to be redeemed because I don't want it to be easy. And kind of let people give you the idea of like, oh, okay, he was redeemable because he actually wasn't really that bad of a villain.
Well,
But
yeah.
if they tell the story well, I think it could well be a like, hey, if cops watch this and are like, oh, maybe I can wake up and like not be a part of this horrible police system in this country or whatever. That's not the worst thing in the world.
I mean, when I say he's a terrible character, like what is the worst thing he did? Right? Like he sought justice for murders and went on this adventure and I believe he got some of his subordinates killed in
Right.
the firefight. That's bad.
Yep.
Right? But he personally, I don't think he killed anyone.
I think he might have killed someone in the riots on Ferrex, but I'm not positive. But
I
yeah,
don't
no,
think
definitely
he had
does
a-
not. He doesn't seem to be like, he believes in the Empire, but
Yeah.
he's the sort of person who I think like if he got to find out about the Empire blowing up Alderaan, I don't think he'd say good. I think he would, he might be like, oh, they had to do it for some terrible reason, but that might be his breaking point. I think he believes that the Empire is good for everybody. And that's the kind of person I think who, like, if they learned that that's not the case, there could be some conversion.
So like even him, like he believes in order, as you said, like the
Right.
order that the Empire brings. He believes in justice. So if he is shown that the Empire does not bring justice,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps. I
Yeah.
mean, like he saves Dedra in the finale He said during the riots, and I don't think he even had a weapon in that moment. He might have because he was hunting Andor, but I don't believe he was like shooting rioters. His focus was on Dedra, and when he sees her in trouble, he goes out and grabs her,
Right.
which was like a whole different thing with his character. But
So yeah.
she's evil, right? Like she tortures Bix,
Hmm.
and I would say that she is evil, whereas Karn is, I don't know, he's a bootlicker, but I don't believe he's done anything evil.
Well, this is another. I think this could be another really interesting topic for us to explore. Is I think a lot of like I think from what we know, I would agree with you,
Yeah.
but we didn't see Dedra have breakfast with her over dominating mother. You know, like we have seen things to make us sympathetic to Cyril in the way we saw her somewhat in like her having her girl boss moments. There's like sexism and her being treated badly in the workplace.
Yeah.
And,
I
and
mean,
I
I kind of cheered in that scene, and then I was like,
yeah
oh, wait a minute, dang it.
yeah me too. I was like, you go. Oh, you no.
But that's why this show is great, is because it gives
Yeah.
us that complexity.
Well, so let me switch gears a bit, and this is also going to be Star Wars, but I promise we won't just talk about Star Wars. I brought some other examples as well. But let me ask you about another person who complies with the Empire
Hmm.
until they do reach their breaking point. Lando Calrissian. How do you think of Lando Calrissian in terms of these stories and these questions we're talking about?
I'm not sure how he would fit in. Like
Because
what?
I think in many ways he's kind of like the administrator that you were talking about before. He knows the rebellion is happening, and he's not joining it in any way, even though he obviously has a lot of like combat experience and stuff like that. He's just trying to keep his little corner of the area. He wants to be able to administrate it himself under the Empire, just like that administrator. He doesn't want the Empire to come in and take over. And he's even willing to sell out his friend to make a deal to make that happen. And again, in his mind, he's doing it to protect his people. And it's only when that deal gets broken further and further and further, and the people he's trying to, the charitable reading is that the people who he feels responsible for, the uncharitable reading is his position of power. But either one, it's only once those are threatened that he turns on the Empire and joins Han and Leia joins Chewie and Leia to try and help rescue Han and all the rest.
Yeah, I don't get the same feeling from Lando,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe it's because we don't know as much about Bespin and
Yep.
where it fits into the Empire. Like, obviously, it is like a corporation,
Right.
but I like Premor is shown to be like a large, almost like trade federation or banking clan esque entity.
Right.
In my opinion, like that's what they're showing us. Whereas Bespin just seems like Lando's company.
Right.
So to me, yes, like he is trying to protect his people, but it's kind of just like the one company factory on Bespin.
Right.
Whereas the whole thing with Premor is like, as was shown in Andor, it's not just about the Empire taking over a company, like it's all taking over the entire system, like star system or whatever.
Right. A sector of
Yeah.
numerous systems. I definitely think that you're right, but I wanted to bring it up because I think that, to me at least, I think one of the things that we see in these stories all the time is that, like, like I said at the beginning, authoritarian governments do all kinds of thing to get people to give compliance. And
Hmm.
and one of them is getting people to think very granularly and very like, don't think about those people over there, because if you try to help those people over there, you and your people are going to get hurt. So you should think about you and your people only. And that's where I really think Lando comes into this. And it's like another example that I think about a lot is in um uh the Infinity War movies, when one of the people who has one of the secrets of getting the Infinity Stones is Gamora, and Thanos tortures Nebula, her
Hmm.
sister, and says the only way that I will stop torturing your sister is if you give me this stone. And what he's essentially telling her is, I you know I am asking you to throw literally half the light, because at this point everyone knows what his plan is. I'm asking you to throw literally half the life of the universe under the bus to protect this one person that you care about. And I remember coming out of that thinking, on the one hand, thinking, I think Gamora made the wrong decision, and I think she's partially at fault for what happens. And also recognizing, I think everyone in the world, myself included, would make a choice like that for their sibling or their loved one or their child or whatever. Um, but I guess that's my only point here is that I think Lando is an example of one of the things that we can see in these stories a lot because we see it in real life a lot, where the authority will ask you, you know, you can keep you and yours safe as long as you comply with us, as long as you don't make trouble, as long as you don't help the people we don't want you to help. And I think that's an important lesson because it's one more way in which, you know, these governments can hold power.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm just the whole Lando thing. It feels very different because at that point, Leia, like they are full on. I wouldn't even say rebellion. I think at that point it is considered a civil war. Like they are in a state of war, and so I mean he would be harboring. I wouldn't. I guess not war criminals, but harboring soldiers for the opposing side.
Right.
Which is a very different thing, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, no, I think you're right, but also think about how much we heroize those people who do exactly that. The people who, you know, hosted Anne Frank at great threat to themselves, or you know, and any you know refugee situations or things like that. There is great personal risk in helping other times. But I think to me that's one of the key lessons I think of. Like, to me that's why Londo is such an important and inspiring story, is that yes, sometimes the safest thing to do for you and your people is to try and shut out the other people who are suffering, the other people who are at risk, even the other people fighting back. But that Lando eventually realizes that that's not enough. That sometimes you do have to put yourself and your loved ones at risk in order to join the larger fight or whatever it is.
Yeah, I just think like at the point where you let them in, you're already harboring them, so you've already kind of chosen a side. Now the complicated thing about him is he betrays them because he's now choosing the other side.
Right.
And so he flip-flops a couple of times. But I think like initially he should, well, not should have, but like he could have just been like, no, you can't land here. Like
Right.
you all are fighting for the other side, like in this war. I cannot allow you to land here, right?
Right.
It's kind of like what I see as neutral, or at least like, I mean, he would be picking the Empire, I suppose, in a sense. But
Yeah. That makes sense. Let's talk about another character from let's talk about another civilian who winds up trying to help the Empire, and this again is going back to Andor, but not. Who? Sorry, let's talk about another character from Andor who tries to help the Empire, but it winds up not keeping him or his loved ones safe. Talk to me about the character of Tim. And I should say Tim because he has two M's, because in Star Wars we don't want to have too many names that seem exactly like names in our own world. So it's Timm, as the credits made sure that we knew. What do you think of his character and how he fits into these questions?
so Tim is a citizen on Ferrix. He is Bix's boyfriend at the time, and also boss, maybe. Like they're co-workers and they are in a romantic relationship. And then when it comes over the news or whatever, the Hollow Net, that Primor Security is looking for a man from Kenari in questioning for the murders, he's like, "Oh, I remember Bix telling me that Andor or Cassian was from Kenari,"
Right.
and he turns them in, and that's what leads to the first battle on Ferrix, where Karn and his little security troopers come in. But as a result, Tim is killed in the, not quite a riot at this point, but in all of the fighting. He Bix is running to warn Andor, and he is running after her to stop her from warning Andor. and she's captured, and he tries to save her from the security guards, and he gets shot
Yeah.
and dies. And it's like, yeah, because the show is called Andor and we're rooting for Cassian, we're like, yeah, you deserve that.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't deserve that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really complicated issue, especially because, as I think they make clear, he again is not someone. He's not a diehard for the Empire. He's not like, oh, I have to see justice done. I think part of the issue is that he sees Cassian, I think rightly so, as a romantic rival for Bix.
Mm-hmm.
But it isn't. It would be easy, therefore, to be like, oh, this is the jealous boyfriend who wants to like get his partner's ex killed. I don't think it's as much that as much as I think it is that he, rightly as it turns out, believes that Cassian might get Bix into danger, and so yeah, like I think
Yeah, Cassian's a bad guy, like from his perspective. Like this is
right,
a guy who's a thief, like he owes a lot of people money, like he's not like an upstanding citizen already at this
right,
point at the beginning of the series. And once it comes out that he is wanted for questioning for 2 murders, I can't really like blame Tim for turning Andor in or like pointing a finger, right? Like that's the problem with this situation
yeah.
is that yes, like absolutely, like you're talking to the cops, you're collaborating, but the man is wanted for murder.
I think there's an extent to which Lando and Tim both make the same mistake, which is that they both believe that if they comply with the Empire, that it will mean that they are safe. Because the thing, what Tim realizes, and it's a tragic realization because he gets killed right after it, he does this literally to protect Bix, but it doesn't work because Bix gets tortured and beaten up by the Empire. This is even before she gets seriously tortured, but she gets beaten up, and he sees that and he sees her in danger, and that's what makes him rush towards her, and the Empire kills him.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I again, it's one of those things where I think in a morally perfect world, you recognize that the Empire is illegitimate and wrong, and you do not comply with its authority. And you recognize that you're putting yourself and others at risk by doing that. But if everyone does that, you have the power to bring something down. And that there is, I think, something morally problematic about complying with evil and allowing others to be harmed so that you can keep you and yourself safe. But at the same time, I'm not currently in jail for tax fraud, for refusal to pay taxes, because that's a very hard ideal to live by. And so yeah, it's like I don't think we're supposed to judge Tim. I think we're supposed to think like this is the tragedy of the system, is that it makes people like Tim, it puts people like Tim and like Lando in positions where it feels to them like the right thing to do is to comply with the Empire. And that I think is the fundamental lesson, because I wish none of us learned that, but that's why these systems are so damn powerful, is because they do create that situation.
Yeah. And there's one more example, which is Kino Loy, Andy Serkis's character from the Narkina 5 arc.
Yep.
He's the floor boss of these prisoners. He's literally a prisoner. He's incarcerated. But he initially is collaborating with the warden and the prison, right? By keeping his men, like 20 or so men, 20 to 30 men, in line and working in this slave factory.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing it because if they do better than the other floors, they get benefits, they get more food, and they don't get tortured by the electrified floor. So that, yeah, there's that aspect of he's doing it for the safety and comfort of his men, but he's collaborating, and in the end result, he says, "No, I'm done with this."
Right. Well, and it's the same kind of thing. He's collaborating because he does believe that eventually people will get out, that people will be freed, and it's when he realizes that no, that's a lie. That like again, he trusted the Empire. It turned out they was wrong to do so. That he decides to go at it, and I think his story is particularly brilliant because, like, he knows that he is on a prison in the middle of the water, and as we learn, in this kind of tragic comedy moment, all the prisoners get rescued, get break themselves out, and many of them are jumping into the water. And Andor's like, "Come on!" And he just looks kind of sad and says, "I can't swim." And you see everyone kind of jumping past him, and we don't know what happened, and maybe we'll find out. But I think it's entirely possible that he just got recaptured or he jumped and drowned. And and I say that because that's a clear time of him saying, "This does not help my own self interest. I cannot." If we accept that conceit of what I think they're saying, he cannot free himself through this prison riot. He will not be freed. He will die because he can't swim.
I
But
didn't
but
think that
because
was
he wants everyone
clear.
else to do so, he's willing to say, "I'm going to be I'm not going to be complicit anymore, even though my lack of complicity will help a lot of other people more than me." And yeah, maybe he does live. We don't know, but certainly he's in a much harder position than everyone else.
Well, I'm saying I don't recall it being clear that he knew that the prison was in an ocean or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because that was a surprise to the viewers, right? The audience.
No,
When we
we saw the prisons, but as they were coming into it.
did we? Okay.
Yeah. No, I
Maybe I
looked
just
for it
don't.
because of that exact question.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
I remember being surprised. I guess I wasn't paying attention. So yeah, if you're looking out the window of your transport, I
Yeah.
guess you would know.
Well, but also I think it also proves another part of this, which is that, I think one of the things Kino, he does feel a responsibility to these people, in part because it's better for him if they do well, but also he wants to protect them. And I think that their escape is really kind of gets to the calculus of what is the right thing to do, because he realizes that like one choice is, let's say there's 100 of the prisoners. There's actually a lot more, I think, but I'm just using like basic numbers. 100 people live, but go through a pretty horrible existence, where some of them might be killed at any point. Or this prison break, where we see probably about like 5 to 10% of the prisoners who are trying to escape get killed. Like the thing that they launch is dangerous, and everybody doesn't make it out alive,
Mhm.
and their lives are put directly at risk because of this rebellion that they get started. And to me, I think that's another kind of interesting part of the question, is that kind of like, is it can you risk, the rebellion where a lot of you will get freed, but a lot of you won't, and versus like just accepting the oppression and living under it without challenging it.
Yeah.
What are other kind of, if you can step outside of Star Wars, where else do you see these kind of questions coming up in terms of like the way we see people living under oppression?
I mean, I've distinctly remember having all these feelings while I was watching Godzilla minus one.
Mm,
And that was a post-war setting, post-World War II. But many of the citizens in that movie were upset at
right.
the government, the Japanese government, the imperial government, for putting them through the war. And when they realized they were being lied to, right, about how the war was going and kind of what the point of it all was. And so there was a lot of anger from them about living in that system. So it wasn't like we don't get the view of what it was like other than the very brief first scene with the
Right.
kamikaze pilot. But I still got like that similar sense of, I guess in that case, it was regret
Mm-hmm.
of having been in that system and having been complicit,
Right.
and then using that regret in the fight against a giant kaiju of saying, now this time, like, we're doing this for ourselves. We're not
Right.
fighting for them.
We're gonna learn a lesson this time and do better this next time.
Yeah. And especially the doctor saying, you know, this is a fight where I want everyone to survive. I don't want any casualties.
Right.
Contrasting with the way that the Imperial Japanese conducted the war and had a very callous attitude towards the lives of its soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. It was one of the things I liked most about that movie is how it really showed like, especially that response of the, well, we're now blaming the soldiers when they come back because they were the ones supposed to be fighting for us and they did it so badly. It reminds me a lot of I did a lot of time in college and grad school studying like protest movements in this country and stuff like that. And I think, you know, in many ways, the anti-Vietnam War movement, I think was one of the greatest parts of American civil rights history, you know, American civil protest history. We got a terrible illegal war to end. At the same time, I think one of the groups that was most harmed by it were a bunch of 18 to 22-year-old kids who had either been drafted into the military or had joined the military because they were taught that was their only option, been shipped over to a place they'd never heard of or couldn't find on a map, participated in a terrible war, and yes, many times did terrible things because that's what they were being told to do, again at gunpoint, and then came home and were treated horribly by U.S. leftists. And I think I know that by the time of like the activist movements against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and stuff like that, that had really changed, and there was a real push against like, hey, wait a minute, let's not take this all out on the people who are, you know, at that bottom level. But I think that's one other interesting question of complicity is what are the ethical responsibilities of the person who's drafted to fight in a war that they might think is wrong, or, you know, given orders to do these things? Because I think we really heroize the soldiers who go against it. But for example, the Bad Batch, we're talking a lot about Star Wars today, I guess, but like, you know, the Bad Batch does this really interesting job of saying like the soldiers who went along with the orders are wrong and you should break the orders. But also we kind of have a lot of sympathy for Crosshair because he does go along with the orders and that's what he's always been told and we understand where he's coming from.
Yeah, it's very difficult, especially when you talk about real life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, real people. I disagree with the way military is used, but I cannot like stand in judgment to soldiers, you know, who participate in that, just because I don't know the circumstances of how they entered service or why, and ultimately like that's why like stories like this, like Godzilla -1, when the focus is on the government, right? Like the higher ups were responsible, and then it's like, and everyone else is following orders. Like, you know, that phrase gets used a lot in a sense of like, you can't always follow orders, but when you're in a system, you often have to. And I think one of the primary lessons of stories like this, like all of these that we've been talking about, is that you have to take care of yourself and those around you, and just like figure out a way and try to reduce the harm
Right.
that you cause or that is caused to the people around you. And that's why, like, going back to the original point of the discussion, like someone like the Chief Inspector Hine, right? Like he has two very brief scenes, so we don't really know that much about him, but it's like, I just get the feeling that he was like an okay guy stuck in a bad job that was like trying not to draw the attention of worse people.
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, like you kind of tried to do your best in a bad situation.
And I think that's where this to me becomes such an interesting question, because you're right. I don't think the answer is for us to sit in, you know, neither you nor I has been subject to the draft, neither you nor I has been subject to some of these terrible choices, and to say like, oh well, you know, Gamora was wrong to put her sister's suffering ahead, or you know, that administrator is wrong. It's way too easy. We haven't been in that horrible situation, but I still think there's a place of saying like, and this is where I think that Hunger Games book is so good, because what it kind of reminds us of is like, you're right. I don't think the administrator is evil for going along. I think I completely understand why he does it. But it's because so many other decent people do what that administrator did that the Empire succeeds. You know? And if they don't, that's how the Empire falls. And that's to me this really interesting question. And it's not to go even further into Star Wars. I promise there's other examples, but Star Wars is a great, like, at every point in time we're dealing with terrible oppression. The other, like, when we're talking about soldiers, I immediately think about Finn. In the sequel movies, as people may remember, there's a stormtrooper, FN. He's got a particular set of numbers. I'm gonna get emails.
2187.
187.
2187.
FN 2187. Thank you so much. And he has this moment of, he's watching these villagers getting killed, and he can't do it. He doesn't fire, and he winds up leaving. And I kept waiting for him to sort of be the one to say, like, hey, all those other stormtroopers are like me. They were scared kids who were kidnapped as kids, or born into this. No one's ever given them a chance to think of something different. Can we try to like convert them instead of just killing them? But no, we just slaughter more stormtroopers by the hundreds. And I think that's a little bit of a failing of those movies, but it's it's to me another interesting example of, like, yeah, he is someone who is faced with the reality of the danger of the harm he is doing. Because you're right, protecting yourself makes sense, but like, he would have been a lot safer if he'd fired his gun. By not firing his gun, he puts himself in mortal danger, and he's able to help Poe escape and escape himself. But he was willing to put himself into that danger in order to not do what he thought was wrong. And I guess maybe that's where I'm coming to, is that I think you're right that we can't look at the administrator as evil McEvil Pants, because we have to recognize most of us would probably do something like that too. The question is more like, how do we become more like Finn? How do we become more like Lando when he doesn't comply? How do we become more like the person who's willing to say, yeah, I'm putting myself at risk, I'm putting my community at risk, but because all of our communities are at risk?
Yeah, to me on this rewatch, like it was very relatable.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps it was on the first watch too, but I caught more of it. I caught more of his dialogue, and I was like, yeah,
Yeah.
this guy. Um,
Yeah, no, and I think that makes sense. And I think that's exactly the point. I think there's a lot of people who, out of economic necessity, out of other things like that, take jobs that are part of what makes the machinery of oppression work. And it sucks and it's terrible, and it's easy to say, oh, they're all awful and bad, but it's also easy to say, oh, well, they had no other choice, so it's okay if they just follow orders. And there's got to be some kind of middle ground.
yeah, there's a phrase, no ethical consumption in capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
and that highlights, in a similar way, I would say that there's like no ethical participation in fascism.
Yeah, I think it's fair.
I paid my taxes this week. I'm
Mm-hmm.
complicit. I know that, but some of it is also going to pay for libraries and other things. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like, all right, well, like this is where I am.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I have to do.
Right.
Yes, I am partially complicit.
Yeah. We all are. On that cheery note, well, thank you so much for raising this topic. I think it's a little bit sad, but I think it's why I love Andor so much. It's why I love V for Vendetta so much. There's a whole other discussion about that. We've done full episodes on that show, on that movie, and that comic book. But that's another story that's very much about how are all the everyday people complicit? How are they all involved in supporting this government? And how is it that when they collectively withdraw that consent, that complicity, consent is a very kind of murky word because it's clearly like the consent at the point of a gun, and it's not true consent. But V for Vendetta is fundamentally about people realizing that if they all stop complying at the same time, the government will fall. So yeah, that's another just fun example.
Yeah, but it's very complicated
Mm-hmm.
because what if a government falls? What is it replaced by?
Right.
Like, do you want a full revolution and what that opens the door to, or are you looking to try to make incremental changes?
Right.
And that's kind of the dilemma I think a lot of nations are in right now, is there is this lean towards more authoritarian systems. It's like, do we need to stop that lean and pull it back to a more centrist system, or do like some of these governments need to fall and like reconstitute themselves?
Right.
That's very difficult, like from a historical perspective.
Right.
And like individuals, like it's very difficult for individuals to have the kind of influence or make that decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
But these are the questions that we should be asking, right? Like Star Wars is very easy because the Empire is this
Mhm.
monolithic evil entity in all the forms that it's presented. But I do think like seeing more nuanced takes of like here are some people within the Empire, within the Imperial system
Right.
that are participating in evil but are not like directly involved.
Right.
What should they do, right? Like that's why I love this topic. It's like, what should they do? Was
Yeah.
was this guy correct,
No, I
or
think that
should he have like picked up his blaster and gone and joined the rebellion, right?
I think it's a great
Maybe not that
question,
extreme, but
and I think that that's where, and I guess to me, what I keep bringing up is I'm also interested in the other side because, like you said, like there's some people who want governments to fall, and if that happens, like a lot more people die. You know that's kind of the devil's bargain there of
yeah,
you're gonna have civil war, you're gonna have revolutions, you're gonna have mass chaos, and maybe something good comes of it. And if you think about those people who will say like, no, I voted for Trump because I want to bring about the fall, things like that, and then listen to Lucian say, I want the empire to become more authoritarian. I want them to strike back harder. Literally, these are things he says. He is an accelerationist. He is exactly
yeah,
the same, and I think this also gets into the other issue that is that I don't want to say it. I think this also kind of wraps up with like one of the other core issues is the decision we each have to make about what risk do we put ourselves and our loved ones, hopefully with their consent in our joint discussion, into, is very different from what risks am I willing to take for you, you know, to what extent am I willing to put other people's lives in danger, and what makes Lucian, I think, such a fascinating and troubling character is Lucian is willing to say, I want, like, we don't know where he. This is conjecture because everything in Lucian's story has been up till now. But Lucian wants the Empire to become harsher and harsher and harsher so that people see them.
yeah.
I think he
Well,
would, on some horrible level, be very horrified, but also celebrate the Empire destroying Alderaan. Because he'd be like, look, this will make more people see how corrupt and horrible the Empire is. And if that is what unites people enough to bring down the Empire, that's great for everyone except all the people of Alderaan.
yeah. After the Aldani heist, Mon Mothma tells Luthen directly, "People will suffer because of what you have set into motion."
Right.
And I can't quite remember if he says good, but he accepts it.
Yeah.
And he says we need the Empire to tighten its grip. And I think
Mm-hmm.
he makes like a choking analogy that the Empire's been choking us for a long time and we haven't noticed
Right.
because it's so slow. And it's the same thing I think that Leia says to Tarkin
The more
on the
you
Death
tighten your
Star, right?
grip, the more star systems will slip through your
Yeah.
fingers.
It's the same argument that yeah. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Luthen is an accelerationist. Like he is trying to bring about the fall of the Empire by getting them to react harshly, which like he understands the system and he knows that's what they'll do.
Right. Well, I think these are great questions. Like I said, they're ones that we're going to keep coming back to in other stories as well, but especially in Star Wars. I think we'll probably kind of touch base again at the end of Andor Season 2. But for all of our listeners, what do you all think? Would love to hear what you have to think about these questions in your own lives, in the lives of these stories, in the lives of other stories you want to think about, of characters who you either think of fondly or maybe you're thinking of like kind of judgmentally as we think about all this. If you want to tell me that I'm totally off base to judge Gamora for what she does with Nebula, etc., let me know. All the contact information is in our show notes. But most importantly, I just want to say thank you all so much for being members. Your membership is what allows us to do these kind of special deep dive episodes that I think are some of the ones Riki and I enjoy best. Let us know what other topics you want to hear. But most importantly, thank you so much for being a member. Thank you so much for listening. May the Force be with you. And we're out. So what I chose not to get into because it's just too fraught, but the other story that is very much on my mind right now because we remember it on Sunday is one of the progressive views of the death of Jesus is a story of noncompliance. That the idea being that the resurrection is supposed to not be a physical resurrection, but a challenge to the idea that, like, if the worst thing the Empire can do is kill you, that doesn't, in the end, what does death matter? So that might be something to bring up at a later point. But it
Yeah.
is so
One of the articles I came across is titled "How to Fight Evil According to Andor (parentheses and Jesus)." So,
Oh, yeah.
do you want me to send you this link?
Yeah, please do. Please do. All right. And on that note, I need to go fight the evil of hunger by cooking dinner for my spouse and myself. But we will talk more soon.
Great.
Peace.
It's done yet.